Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidents. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm also a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast is Matthew Pines. Matt is a management consultant at the Krebs Stamos Group, and he is a fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. He is not here in his capacity at Krebs Stamos Group, but he is a management consultant there. We recorded this on August the 11th. This will come out in a couple weeks. This is one of the episodes that I pre-recorded while I'm out on my paternity leave. I don't think anything in here is that time sensitive. We talked mostly about the geopolitics of cybersecurity, a really good primer on that topic, and a little bit about Bitcoin. We're going to have Matt back on to talk about Bitcoin later. Otherwise, you can write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments, though I'm not really checking my email that closely right this second. We'll be back to our normal cadence shortly. But in the meantime, hit me up there. Hope you enjoy this podcast. If you haven't rated or reviewed the podcast yet, please consider doing so. And otherwise, cheers. Thank you for listening. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Matt, you're joining a long line of humans that I've met on Twitter, and eventually we chat and you come on the podcast and we talk about interesting things. So it's really nice, A, to have you on the show, and B, to know that Twitter is not just a cesspool of awfulness.
Not all of it, no. Thanks for having me.
We're gonna try and cover two big topics. I don't know whether we're gonna get full. Maybe we'll stick on the first one and we'll have to bring you back for the second one. But the reason I was interested in having you on initially was because I'm conscious of how little I understand cybersecurity and how cybersecurity intersects with geopolitics. It's been one of the blind spots I would say in my analytical toolkit for a long time, and for a lot of different reasons, I am quickly remedying that problem. So in some ways, our conversation is meant to help me do that, but I'm also hoping we can sort of point the listeners to separating signal from noise and understanding what you should be worried about, what you shouldn't be worried about, things like that. So if you're talking to somebody who, is fairly well informed about politics, but doesn't feel like they know anything about cybersecurity, sort of where would you tell them to start for orienting from sort of an analytical framework? Like how do you start thinking about an issue that is as big and as amorphous as cybersecurity?
Yes, it is quite a complex topic that touches everything from the humdrum, best practices like two-factor authorization, change your password regularly, that sort of basic stuff, which is not necessarily geopolitically relevant, but it's sort of the bedrock upon which, how you protect yourself, your organization, et cetera. And there's a lot of research and best practices that the government puts out, the private sector puts out about how to secure your individual networks, your corporate networks, all the way up to sort of government networks. From a geopolitical perspective, the key sort of analytical framework that I think you need to slot cybersecurity in is as a emerging instrument of national power that can be used to coerce competitor states and sort of help support what you might call sort of sub-threshold conflict. Goes by various names, asymmetric warfare, gray zone warfare, hybrid warfare, et cetera. And so cybersecurity as an element that states can leverage to support that sort of domain of competition is where it becomes much more relevant to sort of a geopolitical perspective. And that's where the questions of deterrence, questions of sort of cyber physical effects, and sort of the broader evolution that the United States and our allies and competitor states start to think about cybersecurity as a weapon or as a tool of economic coercion or as a way to destabilize their competitor societies. And so that's where I sort of I think is more interesting to get into that topic, other than there's a lot of written about kind of more technical aspects of cybersecurity. What does zero trust mean? And there's quite a professional discipline that looks at these questions and makes recommendations to corporations, to governments, to individuals, small businesses, et cetera, about how to make sure their cybersecurity practices are sort of up to snuff. That's probably not as interesting for kind of the geopolitical analysts who are trying to think about how this is going to play a role in kind of the unfolding dynamic of sort of increasing competition and geopolitical conflict this decade. So that's where I think we can kind of dig into it and start looking at it from that angle. That's
Yeah, although I don't want to leave questions like zero trust and things like that because I think they are interesting. Is it like, because you're talking about the sort of tactical aspects of two-factor authentication and all these passwords that I can't remember, but I mean, is it going so far to say that that actually could represent a serious threat if like somebody who's working at a major water utility or at a major sort of defense plant, like, clicks on the link that the Nigerian prince sent him $25 million and inputs some information? I mean, that's sort of the back way into at least some of these types of things, right? Or am I simplifying things too much?
No, 100%. And that's, while there are a lot of advanced techniques to really get after hard targets, often, the attackers will want to go for the low-hanging fruit, right? And so they're not going to use the most advanced, quote-unquote, zero-day exploits if they can just find sort of an unlocked door and walk in that way. And that's actually what happened with the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident, where essentially a former administrator had set up a sort of remote access to the operational network and wasn't using two-factor authorization, never changed his password. And so that was an easy way, a relatively easy way, to get into a critical infrastructure network and cause strategic level effects that the United States had to respond to. And it wasn't exactly a very advanced attack. And so that is definitely strategically relevant when you have best practices that are pretty basic not being followed. So, for example, like the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, which is the domestic agency responsible for cybersecurity as well as infrastructure security more generally, is really focused on providing best practices and trying to like bring up the lower bar of capability across the board in domestic infrastructure. And there's like 16 critical infrastructure sectors that they define, things that sort of keep society running. And society has become ever more digitally enabled, and all of these critical infrastructure networks, when they fail, can have strategic and sort of cascading impacts. And so that's where the question of domestic preparedness, domestic resilience is becoming extremely relevant. And from an international sort of geopolitical perspective, the net effect is it sort of closes the virtual geographic distance between our adversaries and us. The United States was and is a continental power, protected on both sides by oceans and north and south by friendly neighbors. And that sort of gave us an inherent defensive advantage in a global system where our competitor states had borders that they had to defend with potentially hostile states. And that sort of structures their entire sort of frame for defense and national security. The United States, was able to kind of protect itself by virtue of just its geographic advantage. And cybersecurity closes that virtual distance. That's not a very insightful observation, but I think it's still strategically critical because it means that states have a way to strike at our domestic capabilities in a way that would never be able to do. Right? You can't just like land. Like the Chinese are never going to land an amphibious invasion group in California, right? But they can cause debilitating and sort of societal destabilizing effects using cyber potentially, and that makes it strategically relevant from a geopolitical perspective.
Well, I don't know. I remember I was in high school and I met a family friend's new boyfriend. And I remember vividly he came into our house and was telling me that Hurricane Katrina was actually a Chinese plan to invade the United States via the Mississippi River. And he was very convinced this was going to happen. So never say never. But I love this idea of closing the distance between the United States and the rest of the world. Because you're right. This is the one geopolitical fact that allows the U.S. to make incredible mistakes like the Iraq War, for example. And really, I mean, we've paid a cost for it in terms of lives and money and things like that. But most countries, if they made a mistake on that order of magnitude, would probably collapse, probably wouldn't be around anymore. And the United States can sort of shrug it off and go on to its next sort of big mistake. Is there any... Again, I'm gonna show my own ignorance here, but I think it's good to ask stupid questions and learn that way. Is there any way in which distance still does help the United States from a cyber perspective? Like, can we pull up the drawbridge in some ways? Can we cut off submarine cables to actors that are trying to penetrate the network somewhere? Or am I misunderstanding how the actual sort of infrastructure backend works for how different countries or different actors might attack U.S. networks?
Well, one important thing why is cybersecurity itself a target is because it's the backbone upon which modern economies function, right? Like the internet if it was just, cat memes and sort of Twitter banter, right? Attacking that and taking that down, wouldn't necessarily be a big deal. But it's the fact that modern enterprise networks are built in the cloud, right? So one of the major changes has happened in sort of how the modern corporation functions is the rise of sort of cloud services, where the company itself doesn't usually maintain their own servers for their own corporate networks. They use these large cloud service providers, where all of the corporate data and functions exist. And so, like, to the extent the company exists at all and is able to accomplish its economic objectives, relies on those services functioning. And so that's where it moves from being, okay, the internet is cat memes, to where it is critical infrastructure for the basic performance of our economy. And in an open economy where the provision of these services and where these corporations are globally integrated, taking down those networks can have a dramatic effect on the equity values and employment if these companies go bankrupt. And so we are a global power. It means our companies are integrated with most of the rest of the world. And so pulling up the drawbridges, it doesn't really, like, that would basically just be, accomplishing our adversaries' objectives for them. If they want to cut our cables, that's going to have a lot of a strategic effect on us, because we were the ones who tended to benefit from the internet itself. That was the backbone upon which globalization really happened. You had the kind of hard infrastructure of trade and manufacturing outsourcing, but sort of the second wave was globalization of services, right? Huge amounts of services are provided from other countries to American citizens, and if those were disrupted, it would have debilitating effects on our economy. So you mentioned, like, one vector of attack is these, like, the internet isn't just this sort of ethereal thing that sort of floats in the quote unquote cloud. It's hard infrastructure. It is fiber optic cables. It is satellites. It is relays. It is a whole web of infrastructure and data centers that are physically located, and those are becoming and have become sites of sort of you might call in the intelligence world, right? Those are sites of extreme contest. It's been well known that, like, lots of governments that have submarine capability tap those fiber optic cables to collect intelligence. But that same capability can be leveraged to cut those cables. And the internet is a decentralized system, but it's self-healing up to a point. And so you can cut a cable, you can cut a cable, you can sort of cause some minor disruptions, but for the most part, the internet can sort of self-heal and route around those sorts of breaks in the network. There are, but it's a nonlinear system. So if you make a number of these cuts in strategic locations, up to a point, you can take large swaths of the network down, and there's only so much you can repair in such amount of time. So that is especially a concern in financial markets, right? There's certain cables that connect, say, London to New York, right, or connect Hong Kong to other sort of trading networks, and those the financial system that we're used to seeing pop up on CNBC or the Bloomberg relies on data being shared, and the sense of trillions of dollars being traded each day on these exchanges, that can be cut, and so that is that's where you have kind of cascading impacts across the rest of the economy. And, we're financial power, we're commercial power, so we're much more asymmetrically exposed to internet going down than necessarily some of our adversaries are.
How exposed are we? Let me rephrase that question. How exposed are militaries to this sort of disruption? Has, for instance, the United States military and the Chinese military and the Russian military been able to get themselves away from being dependent on some of these same networks, or are they in a similar sort of situation? I ask because, I feel like if you read Ghost Fleet or 2034, or all of these novels that are coming out imagining a third world war that is usually pitting the U.S. against China, it all starts with, the Chinese were able to hack into a system and the U.S. was unable to have their ships work because we were reliant on networks. But the one ship that wasn't on the network, Battlestar Galactica style, saves the day and everything is fine. So I'm wondering, how serious is this, not just from a corporate perspective, but from a military perspective? Are defense forces as dependent on these things as we have become on them in our daily lives?
The short answer is yes. It's more complicated exactly how. They're fundamentally different networks, right? So the Pentagon isn't communicating over sort of the same fiber optic cables for their core command and control and intelligence communications. So they have their own systems, and those systems are subject to intense intelligence collection and adversary disruption. Especially with the rise of what you might call like network-centric warfare. The Chinese military doctrine is informationatized. I think that's the right word. Warfare. This idea of which really, the United States kind of demonstrated really in the Gulf War, of being able to have an integrated sensor communications network, coordinate sort of joint operations in a wartime environment, and rapidly share information, sort of data fusion over satellite networks, kind of local tactical communication networks. Like that was the sort of, that actually the Chinese studied that and realized this is the way of future warfare. And that's, only accelerated and is going to continue to accelerate. There's a lot of research that's been going on for a number of years in how to, at different scales, there's sort of strategic level scales. We have systems like nuclear weapons, which can never fail. And there's all sorts of, primary, secondary, tertiary communication systems to ensure that, the nuclear launch codes get to their desired targets. All that's very classified, but those are certain systems. They're standalone systems for the nuclear command and control. And then there's, range of sort of battlefield communications, tactical communication systems from, satellites that are in different orbits to airborne kind of relay to kind of local self-healing is the idea, kind of mesh networks between different systems. So the basic premise of our current kind of operational battlefield for communications is the sort of web of communications and tactical data links between ships, underwater vehicles, drones, satellites, all the way back to kind of the commanders at both the theater, the regional, and the strategic level back in the United States. So there is a premise that we will have, or that network will remain relatively undegraded in order to prosecute our military objectives in any conflict. As you can imagine, adversary states like China are investing heavily in the ability to disrupt, degrade, or destroy those battlefield networks. And they're investing a lot in what you might call electronic warfare capabilities, whether that's disrupting satellites, which you can do in a lot of different ways. You can dazzle them with lasers, so their optics basically can't see everything, which is considered like non-destructive interference with satellites. All the way up to you can sort of park a follower satellite that could just either jam or physically send a projectile into another satellite. Potentially can do other things, take control of it potentially. So space warfare is a thing, and that is intimately connected into communications, because one of the main functions of the satellites is to support communications. So yeah, it is. I read Ghost Fleet, and the idea that there's some sort of secret switch that the Chinese can flip, and then everything goes dark. I think that's probably an exaggeration. I won't be giving any sort of classified assessments, but this is not as simple as that. There isn't one master root capability that just allows you to flip the switch and everything is now dead, right? But they're investing a lot of capabilities across lots of different domains, targeting specific systems. The U.S. invests heavily in red teaming their own systems, so there's elements of the U.S. government who specialize in simulating what an adversary would try to do against a certain platform. How would you try to hack into an aircraft carrier systems, and what are its vulnerabilities? And just a corporation would want to look at how its vulnerabilities are can be exploited. The Defense Department does the same thing, and so there is a constant game of cat and mouse. Are we actually capturing all the potential vulnerabilities, ways our systems could be hacked or disrupted, and what can we do to mitigate that? So yeah, in any real conflict, it's never as clean as neither the offensive capabilities are guaranteed to work, but neither are your defensive mitigations guaranteed to work. And it's a question of what's your backup plan? And the U.S. Navy, I think I don't exactly know when, but started training their sailors on star navigation, right? The backup to the backup to the backup. When you got nothing, when you're just totally dead in the water, but you have a functioning engine and weapon systems, can you still engage? Can you still navigate and have at least some tactical capability sustained? So it is an issue. It's very much a lot of those actual vulnerabilities are certainly classified, but it's certainly one aspect of the United States capability that needs to be heavily examined, especially in a conflict with a peer state like China that's investing specifically in capabilities to hit that aspect of our capabilities.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about cyber warfare, but before we get there and leave this general topic, I want to ask about China and 5G and Huawei and that whole thing. It's the one part of this conversation where I know enough to be a little bit dangerous because 5G has intersected geopolitics in a major way, because the United States basically said, Huawei they make the best kit for the lowest price, and most emerging markets, when they looked at, do I pick Nokia or Ericsson or Huawei, I'll take the cheap one that still works. I don't care. Like, what are the Chinese going to come to Equatorial Guinea and solve or spy on what we're doing, and that's going to affect us somehow? Like, most countries don't sort of think that. Do you think that fears about Huawei gear and in 5G networks were overhyped? Do you think it sort of goes to the psychology of, like, if the gear is in the network, then they'll be able to flip a switch and get access to anything? Or is there a real danger that if you have any kind of Chinese-made gear in a wireless network system or anywhere, that is a backdoor into these situations, and that could be the sort of long-term implication of having a company like Huawei be as dominant as it is in the world?
Yeah, so certainly Huawei, ZTE, and those sorts of hardware manufacturers, you should just bank on the fact that anything the Chinese want to get from those networks, they can. Whether they are actively getting it in a sort of active collection mode, I can't say, but the capability to get whatever they want out of those systems exists. That's definitely the case. But I think it's broader than that, right? And it wouldn't just restrict the threat surface to specifically Chinese companies installing those sorts of systems. There's been stories in the public domain for a number of years about the risk of hardware being seeded into Western electronic supply chains that allows the Chinese to sort of on-demand activate what you might call like sleeper agents inside a particular network that has installed certain servers. So that's been a very, and we're getting to the point now where like the hardware manipulations sort of happen at the chip level when they're manufacturing them. And they're, the ones that were discovered like 7-8 years ago were like microscopic. So you can imagine where they are now, extremely sophisticated, not something that you just be able to tell. And these things went undetected for many years. And it took a major sort of whole government effort to sort of get various Western companies to sort of strip out that infrastructure and replace it. So that is a major, often the conversation about reliance on China from a chip perspective has strategic national implications when it comes to, basic economic, right? Can we get the next iPhone? Our reliance on that as just a supply chain to support economic activity and the production of consumer goods. But there is also, the Chinese government, like any government, would look at that and be like, well, this is an excellent opportunity to, compromise Western commercial and government networks, and they've invested a lot trying to leverage that capability. So yes, I think people underestimate the ability of the Chinese to focus on leveraging their position in the supply of these electronic components to support their intelligence and strategic objectives. Like any state, you should expect them to apply any measures they can, and even when they're caught, like there is no other option. So there's very few other options. And to your point, right, some states just don't really care, right? They're just trying to bootstrap their economy up from a really basic level, and their trade-off calculation is, well, we don't really care if they can listen to everything we have to say. Like, at least our society gets functioning cellular networks, and we can now have a digital economy, and the GDP growth from that like more than counterbalances any potential espionage threat. And like to your point, like the Chinese people think about like espionage from a perspective of, they're going to be able to get our information. But really, the Chinese have a very specific national objective to indigenize Western technology in order to create more self-sufficiency and also to capture, quote, unquote, like the leadership position in a number of like key strategic industries. They targeted the sort of the made in 2025 industries as like really the focus of their industrial espionage and sort of economic intelligence collection. And so, a lot of these, countries that don't have those sorts of industries will be like, well, we're not going to be the focus of that collection anyways. And so we can at least get the cheap, Huawei equipment. But I think you've seen in the past few years the warnings from Western intelligence officials become louder and louder, and becoming a lot more pointed at Western multinationals who have sort of implicitly made this strategic trade-off with globalization, where capturing the Chinese market kind of was the principal sort of decision factor. And I think now that the fact that China is probably hitting a recession and is not likely to continue the rapid pace of sort of credit-fueled explosive growth that they were able to maintain for the past 10, 15 years, makes that calculation a little bit easier in the minds of Western multinationals, who are also sort of now post-Ukraine kind of reappraising the geopolitical risk premium associated with their globalized corporate operations, which also have a network element to them, right? So a lot of companies not only went out and developed intense interest in China and other countries as part of sort of the wave of globalization, like this is where our growth is going to come from, but they then built their corporate networks with that sort of premise, a sort of globalized, relatively flat, centrally managed sort of enterprise networks and architectures that basically gave an employee in China a laptop that was fundamentally very similar to a laptop in Sacramento, right? And then try to manage that corporate network, especially with a mode towards collaboration and information sharing. And how do we we learn from certain aspects of our operation over here that should be shared with everyone else around the world. And that was sort of built into a lot of companies' mindsets. And now that's having to go a little bit in reverse. Now they're all not like, let's get out of China, right? Like it's more of a, how do we prepare? How do we posture for potential escalation scenarios? And how do we, kind of isolate our networks or restructure our network architecture in such a way as to mitigate the potential impacts of increasing conflict or friction between the United States and China. And so that's where the sort of cyber element starts to play into some of these corporate decisions. And yeah, that is just now kind of hitting kind of a new level. It started really with the banks in Hong Kong after the national security law, and they were kind of the center of the bullseye. And Hong Kong was sort of where you would expect it to start. Hong Kong was sort of the bridge between the Western financial system and China. Like that was their sort of raison d'etre, is acting as kind of that point of funnel and kind of transition between these two different economic systems. And when the Chinese basically fully enveloped them into kind of the Chinese system, a lot of the sort of Western banks there had to kind of recalibrate their position. And now that line of thinking and that posture for kind of security is expanding in sort of concentric circles out to other industries that believe they may be subject to sort of increasing attention by the Chinese government.
Yeah, that brings up a two-part question for me, which is, number one, how far does this go? So, for instance, I at least experience a lot of companies thinking about nearshoring or reshoring operations, and they think largely in terms of politics or geography or how much labor is there and what are the costs, what are the regular. But I mean, let's take a very practical example like Mexico, which, as far as I know, has not ruled out having Huawei in any of its wireless networks and doesn't want the United States to tell it what to do on its networks, especially under this particular government. Should a U.S. company that wants to expand in Mexico be worried that Mexican networks are built with Chinese gear and that exposes them to some kind of vulnerability, or that the United States government might limit their ability to operate there? That's the first part of the question. Then the second part of the question is, we're talking a lot about U.S. and China because they're the two main actors, but there's a whole rest of the world out there. So are we looking at a world where it really is sort of, you're in like the U.S. trust network or you're in the Chinese trust network? Or are we looking at a world where Japan's going to have its own and Turkey's going to have its own and Russia's going to have its own? And maybe, some of these networks are really shitty because they have bad gear and they're building stuff from scratch, but you're going to have to basically traverse these different cyber and digital obstacles every time you're going into a new market, rather than the sort of, as you said, globalized horizontal world that we've gotten used to. So there's a two-part question there.
Yes. So the first question, with respect to, say, like Mexico is an example where just because they're using Chinese equipment, does that pose a threat to them? And I would say risk is a spectrum. And just because there's a potential latent capability doesn't mean that capability will be leveraged against you as a particular target. And so that's often where people kind of make, the judgment jump is there is a threat, therefore I have to take an action. And, it's a risk calculation. How much risk do you think you want to accept? And the premise of that calculation is, how likely am I, as a particular industry, going to be targeted by the Chinese? And that depends on what industry you're in. So if you're in a really sensitive, both from a U.S. perspective, say you're an aerospace defense company that's got some really, juicy tech and IP, the Chinese are definitely interested in capturing. They're going to try to go after that IP, like wherever it is in the world, right? And they're not just going to, not try to target you because you're not using a Huawei network, right? They're going to try to use insider threat. They're going to try to use more direct penetrations, all sorts of, the full spectrum of kind of intelligence operations to get at like that really high value IP that they want. And so if you think you're potentially subject to that, well, then your risk sort of posture should be much higher than anyone else. If you're just, making, cheap consumer goods or durables, the Chinese don't really need that IP. Right? They already have that in spades. They're not going to waste, the intelligence effort or the relationship with a third-party government like Mexico at targeting you just because you're existing on their system. And so even in China, right, this is a question, right? Like if you're operating in a certain industry that the Chinese are really not prioritizing, the chances of you becoming the subject of like a direct target of an espionage operation is relatively low. And especially if you're operating, with good best practices for your own corporate security and insider threats, right? Like you would do against any competitor, right? You're more likely worried about your competitors taking your information than like the Chinese government necessarily. And so the same practices you would do to, protect your IP, your trade secrets, your corporate networks against not only the Chinese government, but just against ransomware actors, against anyone that might want to, disrupt you. Like that's a best practice. And there's there's sort of, it's on a spectrum, right? So the other key development, and the reason why China in particular is more of a focus for certain sort of Western multinationals is not just like the technical aspects of, how they approach their intelligence collection, but like the policy environment. So there have been laws passed in China that are, and it's like rule by law, right? Not rule of law in China. And so it's a pretty broad and expansive policy requirements on all firms operating in China that apply to all the potential data that those corporations might hold, and that potentially put them under a risk of being compelled to share information with the Chinese government that maybe they would rather not share, whether it's information about their clients, information about their corporate operations, their corporate employees, et cetera. And so there, it's a jurisdictional matter, right? If that data sits in a server in China, that can be, that can get a visit by a Chinese government official, that is high risk. If you don't want that data to be, easily accessible to the Chinese government by just, coming and knocking on the door with a piece of paper, you would want to move that data out of the country, right? And still have access to it from your Chinese operation potentially, but it's sort of outside the reach of the Chinese jurisdiction. And so that is a lot of the consideration now is what sorts of data potentially is subject to these this sort of policy trend. And then, the basic mitigation for that is just to move it, to another location outside of China and the APAC region where your Chinese operation can still use it, but it doesn't, itself is not vulnerable. And also trying to suss out what sorts of data do we have that we think the Chinese government would want to get, right? Because you don't want to just move everything just for the sake of everything, and that might have effects on your business operation, your performance. And again, we're still in this environment where like China is still a market for Western multinationals, and it's, we're still heavily invested in this country. They're not ready to just like do a full 180 and just exit the Chinese market, right? And so it's like, how do we accommodate, how do we prepare and mitigate against the rising geopolitical risk, but also this policy trend, and what can we do to our networks and our data to kind of mitigate that risk? But that's where the focus is right now. The sort of reshoring, friendshoring trend, it really is going to be subject to what is your industry? Are you likely to be a target or not? And if you are likely to be a target, well, then anywhere you are, you should think about your risk from that perspective.
Before we turn to some other topics, I wanted to ask, so we've been talking a little bit in abstract terms. Has there ever been what you would classify as a cyber war in human history yet? I think one of the things that people were surprised with was that and maybe I'm just not paying attention to the right things, but in this Russia-Ukraine war, there have been some things, but it doesn't seem to me that it's been as intense as it could be. We get all sorts of doomsday scenarios about, oh, they're going to hack the water, or people are going to do this to each other, and nobody does it. And maybe it's a mutually assured destruction sort of thing. But it seems to me that most of the real serious types of things that impact our daily lives when it comes to cyber is some group that's going to hack the Colonial Pipeline in your example or something like that. It doesn't feel like we have seen full state on state. Here are all of our capabilities. We're going after you and achieving some strategic objective with our cyber capability. It doesn't seem to me like that's happened. So am I not paying attention? Is it more of a fear in the future sort of thing? And that when the gloves come off in a real conflict, we would see this sort of stuff? Help me parse through the level of conflict we've seen in the world.
You're right. We haven't seen, quote unquote, like what Leon Panetta called back in like 2012 as like the cyber Pearl Harbor moment, right? And that was when sort of cyber was sort of emerging as this new domain in U.S. government defense and sort of policy circles. And there was that perception in that early phase of this topic as there being this, potential bolt from the blue, everything will just not work right. There's like the, what was the movie with Bruce Willis? Anyways, but the idea like that, like we'll just take down everything, right? That like a hacker can find like the one piece of malware that's going to like take down the grid, right? That's really not the case, right? Like, all these systems like are fundamentally vulnerable, but also there's a lot of them and they all have different vulnerabilities to a certain extent. And so if you really want to have like a debilitating society-wide effect, it's going to require a massive investment of resources on the attacker side. It's very vulnerable because it's like a perishable access. You have to constantly maintain access to those networks. It's not like you just build the missile and it's like ready to be fired. You got to constantly be, and your attacker's looking for you. I mean, your adversary's looking for you the whole time, and so your capability of, say, accomplishing that effect is going to wax and wane potentially. And so it's not as reliable as an instrument of national power as like a weapon system, which is like we press the button, the missile goes, and so it's sort of lack of predictability on the offender side makes them a little bit more hesitant to use it, because if you try to press the button, so to speak, you task the SBR and the GRU and everyone like go big, guys, and if it fizzles out or if it doesn't cause the effect that you want, like you're now really vulnerable because you should expect that like we can do the same thing to you, maybe more. And so this is where the aspect of like cyber deterrence is a really intense field of research, because with mutually assured destruction, this sort of deterrence models basically assume that like the nukes will get there. Most of them will get there. And so it's a matter of like then reasoning and sort of, the von Neumann, right, calculation that the RAND guys did is like, okay, this is like a stable deterrence regime of mutually assured destruction. The sort of the risk of cyber is really the fact that it's not as predictable, and therefore it's hard to create kind of the game theoretic anchor point, right? Sort of the Schelling point where we all mutually recognize the effectiveness of each other's capabilities, and therefore we should like refrain from engaging in them. A little bit more of an unstable dynamic there, where because you might have ambiguity, that might lead you to be more risk averse, or it might lead you to be more risk seeking because you think you can actually hit the other guy and undermine his ability to then launch a counterstrike in the very act of you attacking them first, right? And so that is a very complicated, and this is a posture the U.S. government moved in the past few years called like defend forward, which is a nice Orwellian term. You might say it's like you're basically hacking the other guy, right? You are engaged in an offensive operation. You are penetrating an adversary's networks to establish persistent access, and you have to do that like constantly in order to maintain the presence in the network that you would need if, say, the commander in chief said, "I want you to, execute this operation." We became public after the election with how we took down the Internet Research Agency, and we've indicted Russian hackers, Chinese hackers, North Korean hackers, Iran. There's like the top four kind of cyber states, and there's a constant game kind of taking place, kind of in the intelligence world of back and forth, right? But it's maintained at that level. We haven't seen it sort of trigger into an all-out kind of we're going to take down your grid, your water treatment plants, your financial networks, your hospital systems. Take your self-driving cars and crash them into a ditch, right? Like there's like all sorts of bad things you can imagine happening. We haven't seen those happen. But and that's the debate right now is with Russia. Like, was it a paper tiger, right? Was it did we overhype their capabilities and we just haven't seen, what what we thought we were going to see. And I kind of come down the middle. I think there were a lot of attacks on Ukraine, but I think the Russians in their model were like, we don't want to destroy their infrastructure because we're going to have this multi-axis invasion. We're going to take Kiev. We're going to assassinate their leadership, and our sleeper agents are going to rise. And we're basically going to have this sort of fait accompli after a week, right? And so there just wasn't, and that was going to be accomplished by like boots on the ground, right? Like BTGs moving across borders. And when you're doing that, like cyber is like a side thing, right? So they did have some major hacks on some satellite communications networks that were effective and disrupted the Ukrainian command and control to a certain extent. That's why actually they brought in Starlink. Starlink is now providing essentially strategic low capabilities to Ukraine to do kind of drone and artillery targeting and all sorts of things. And that's a whole separate question about the rise of Starlink in like a Taiwan scenario is also relevant now. But that's where I sort of come in the middle of, they just didn't really build it in their battle plan, which was poorly thought through together. But I'm not sure that would be the case. Like, I'm not sure how much I would generalize that in any other conflict scenario. There is like the rise of like hacktivists that are sort of semi-state sponsored. Like Finland was just hit by DDoS. Again, it's not like going to take down their whole society, right? But it's part of the general pattern that you should expect to take place. China's a whole different story. China has the real numbers classified, but like probably 100,000 to 200,000 people just dedicated to like cyber operations, basically, for their government. Like this is like
low.
Well, these are people that are like just like constantly, right? This is like it's like I don't know, 10 times more than we have, right? So like that in itself is a quantity has a quality all its own, right? Like and so the Russians don't have just they have really good kind of niche capabilities, and they are a high threat actor. But also, we know how to target them. We've demonstrated our ability to kind of get into their operational networks and mess around. Not just us, but our allies too have like really good access to their systems and can mess around. Like I think it was the Dutch basically had access to the CCTV cameras inside like the GRU facility and like had video of the guys typing on the computers. So there's those such of systems. So I guess that's a lot of jabbering. I'd say the net assessment that I would have is the risk of, say, domestic cyber attacks that have large-scale physical consequences, whether it's to the grid, whether it's to the water treatment plants. That's still a very live possibility. It's very hard to put a probability on that, right? But it's not something that I would just like discount purely based off of like the Ukraine example. I think people would tend to overgeneralize from that one particular conflict, and that there'd be different conditions, different capabilities, different adversaries in play in other scenarios. And especially in the situation where it's not just the cyber element of like, pure malware, right? Like I've got persistence on your network and I can take control. I can turn things on, turn things off, sort of mess around. I can, just brick your system, whatever it is. That's like well known. But in any large scale conflict, say with like a pure adversary, there's going to be other things that are combined with that, right? Like that are cutting the cables, physical sabotage, activating insider threats that are like really valuable capabilities that you would only use in like a certain scenario. And so that's like where it goes from, this low level kind of battle to then, you have these, China would call them like assassin's mace, right? Like the real in the deep capability that you only pull out, right, in the most extreme circumstances. And any reasoning or observations you have in this domain are not going to tell you anything about that domain. And that's where people have this sort of linear extrapolation. It's like, we see ransomware, we see these sorts of attacks. But, there is this other domain that if things really kicked off, you haven't seen that before. So very hard to say. But also, we do a lot of preparing and posturing for those scenarios specifically. And a lot of intelligence collection goes into that. And so, like, there is this, how effective our mitigation is going to be. But I wouldn't be too sanguine about the risks. Just because, like when we have a hurricane, where we can get even if the adversary's capabilities aren't, like the big scary monster, right? Like our domestic networks infrastructure are not all that strong. So it's like they don't need to have like this game-changing cyber capability to like flip the lights off. Like the lights just go off because we have a bad storm, right? So it doesn't take much to tip some of these systems, which are intensely interconnected, dynamic coupled systems, where even if you don't take down every transformer, if you just hit one, like that can cause some problems. So that's where I think domestic fragility, that's they very little you have to analyze with respect to the adversary's capability. And so even if the adversary's capability isn't as high as you think it is, your domestic resilience may not be that high either. And so you kind of have to build that up too if you want to have some sort of psychological sense of security, which I don't think we should feel right now.
I mean, speaking from personal experience, our domestic resiliency in the Gulf Coast region, which, only the place where most of our agricultural exports go in and out of the country, large percentage of energy production, you name it, like our domestic resilience sucks here. Let's put a pin in that, and we'll come back to cybersecurity in the future. But before I let you go, I want to let you riff on Bitcoin a little bit, because I didn't realize what an evangelist you were until you sent me some of your stuff, and I've been reading through it and seeing some of your Bitcoin appearances. I even wrote down a sentence I wanted to play devil's advocate with you about, which was, and we'll have a link to this white paper in the podcast description, listeners. But you described Bitcoin at one point as a politically neutral reserve asset, and I would think that somebody with your background in philosophy and physics and all these other things would agree with me that there is no such thing as a politically neutral piece of technology, full stop. So tell me why you think Bitcoin is politically neutral, because I get that it's not tied to any one country or something like that, but it seems pretty clear to me that it is very political and has an overt, I wouldn't even call it, it's like an overt political agenda that's attached to it. We can debate whether it's hopeful or optimistic too, but part of your argument was that it was apolitical, and that doesn't seem right to me. So what am I missing?
Well, maybe there's a nuance to shade between jurisdictionally neutral and politically neutral, because political, that term has a valence that, under a certain interpretation, you might say is not a fair representation. When I say politically neutral, I mean like jurisdictionally neutral in the sense of like a reserve asset, like gold is jurisdictionally neutral. Like gold isn't the liability of a particular nation state or jurisdiction, right? Like the dollar or other reserve currencies are, right? So that's the principal frame which I was making that statement is. It is not the liability of a particular jurisdiction. Your ability to use it isn't subject to the sort of access approval of that jurisdiction, right? So any G7 fiat currency reserve asset is subject to the constraint and approval of the issuers of those currencies, and so that's the principal dimension upon which I was making the assessment of it being politically neutral in that sense. But to your point about the broader sociological valence associated with Bitcoin having a sort of, a more kind of like an anti-state modality, right? Like that's kind of, I think, what you're pointing at, right? Most of the kind of original evangelists of Bitcoin, sort of cypherpunk, kind of crypto anarchists, right, really focused on this is a peer-to-peer money. Because it's not state issued, it allows the sort of formation of kind of individual to individual sort of transaction relationships. And there has been that strain of sort of political thought built into the culture around Bitcoin. And so to the extent that you analyze Bitcoin as a socio-technical system, right, it's very hard to untangle that culture from the tool itself, the protocol itself. But I think even though that's maybe historically the case, when you read the Bitcoin code, doesn't say like anything about politics or jurisdictions, right? It just says here's a protocol for engaging in certain transactions, right? This is the UTXO set. Here are the key protocol rules. There's no politics built into the technology. And that extent, it's sort of like you could say like the early internet, right? Like had a certain ideology associated with it. Like when it was sort of coming out of the garage, so to speak, like the early cypherpunks associated with the internet had a certain, say, quasi-political ideology, right? They thought that, and the same sort of thing with the rise of encryption, right? Like encryption technology was about how to secure individual freedom, right? And to the extent that as a political ideology, is opposed to authoritarian systems, then yes, it has a political valence, right? There's no purely neutral technology. And that is a key point that is very relevant, right? So I always think about Bitcoin in the same ways the sort of the early debates about encryption and the internet, confronted existing systems of power, existing systems of conceptions of political governance. And this is going to be a very active site of political and philosophical contest that I think Bitcoin is going to precipitate. So yeah, I'm very interested in those questions in particular. So yeah, I don't mean to sweep under the rug. This is just a purely neutral technology, and it's just going to kind of hum away. But just like the rise of encryption and the internet, there was this like they were political debates, right? There was bills tried to be passed to ban encryption, and there were like big political fights. And I think there was a cryptographer, I forget his name, but basically he like specifically focused on PGP, like printed out like the code, basically. Like, here's how I can print this out. You gonna stop me from just like writing these numbers down? That was a flashpoint of kind of the conflict between the state prerogatives, right, for security, and systems of law enforcement, and the open internet, and systems of open and free kind of peer-to-peer engagement. And where you draw the line as a society between what sort of domain kind of like how big that domain gets, it's essentially this tit for tat, and that's what you're seeing in a new version of with the rise of Bitcoin.
Yeah. The other thing that struck me, and that's a great answer, the other thing that struck me in your paper was, I feel like many people accept that Bitcoin is an asset and think of it as sort of an asset, similar, like you said, to gold. Like, I think I would say that the mainstream thinking about Bitcoin is that, like you said, you don't want to be exposed to monetary policy decisions by a particular government. So if you hold this asset, you can beat inflation, or you're not subject to those same sorts of problems. But you take it a step further, and you really sort of write about Bitcoin as a currency, a real cryptocurrency, and something that is used as a real means of exchange, and thinking about that over time, which, I guess El Salvador is trying to do that with mixed results, and for political reasons of their own, they seem to take a nice percentage of the transaction fee of stuff like that down there, and it's an interesting tool for the authoritarians. But talk to me a little bit about why you think Bitcoin is going to become not just a digital storehouse of value, which I can that is a argument I can see clearly, but the jump to actual currency is a little harder for me to visualize.
Well, to be clear, I have no fixed assumption about how this could unfold. There's lots of there's a distribution of scenarios, and I have sort of different credences applied to that distribution of probabilities. Yeah. And how I assess different scenarios under which Bitcoin monetizes to a certain end state are sort of subject to other auxiliary assumptions about the evolution of the geopolitical system, the associated monetary system there. So it's harder for me to assess Bitcoin with that as the hypothetical end state, without assuming how the larger global system is also going to evolve. There are other things that have to happen, or that will happen, if that's the course of events. And so there's both. That's a very complicated question, right? You'd have to make some additional analytical kind of claims about the status of the global reserve currency, the dollar, the treasury reserve asset, the success or lack of success associated with, say, a rising Eurasian power bloc that tries to move towards a commodity or a gold-backed regional reserve standard. Lots of other things, the avoidance of World War III. Lots sort of things can sort of get in the way, right, of Bitcoin becoming successful to different stages, right? So that's the external, you call it the exogenous kind of analytical frame, which you could go into some depth. And I wrote one paper that tried to look at just one scenario where you could see something like this happening, but it's hard to say this is the scenario and this is definitely the way it'll play out. And that's a whole nother domain of analysis. But just the endogenous analysis of Bitcoin itself, what it would AO ipso prevent it from serving as a currency. Well, there, the real function is volatility, right? So things become a unit of account after having sort of established themselves as being a means of stable transaction, right? If I'm going to pay for lunch tomorrow and hold a certain currency, the reason why I hold that currency is because I think it's going to pay for the same sandwich tomorrow, and a week from now. And that means the volatility over that time scale has to be low enough so that people feel confident in holding it. That's the basic premise about what makes a transaction vehicle. You might call it a medium of exchange. So it's there's three parts of money: the store value, medium of exchange, unit of account. And you might say the precondition for store value is just a collectible, right? So something that people want to hold because it has some semantic or cultural value. And then if that's proven out over time, then it usually acquires a social consensus that the thing is a store of value. Like if you believe and other people believe that something is going to be valuable over time, that usually forms a locus of social consensus that then reifies that object, that monetary good, as having the properties that make it a store of value. So all monies are essentially sociological phenomena, right? There have to be certain real physical properties associated with that thing that can allow it to form a locus for such social consensus. And then that, through like the Lindy effect, reifies over time, becomes much more historically durable. So it's very important to separate out, like in the current monetary system, the reserve currency status of the dollar as a transaction currency, right? To facilitate trade, to denominate international commerce and the liabilities thereof that sort of grease the skids of derivatives market, swaps market, interest rates forwards, et cetera. Like the reason why the dollar has a very strong penetration in the global system is because of the sort of network effects associated with the dollar as a unit of account and as a medium of exchange. Those are exceptionally strong. And just like a network effect that you join because other people join, it gets stronger because more people are in the network. That's very different from the reserve asset status of the Treasury security, which is the most demanded form of collateral in the offshore dollar market, and is also by regulation through Basel III and other compliance regimes. Banks, insurance companies, pensions have to hold this reserve asset on their books. And so the demand for the reserve asset is a function of things like, inflation expectations and its liquidity as a form of collateral to support, offshore dollar leverage and the rehypothecation that those sorts of securities can enable. And so when I see like Bitcoin, I start looking through the lens of, okay, it's a speculative store value, very limited, like about 500 billion total market cap. And so for it to serve as like a global reserve asset at the level of the Treasury security, it has to be at least 10 times larger, more likely 50 times larger. Yeah. So clearly, nowhere in the near-term horizon is it going to supplant the role of the Treasury security as a global reserve asset. And so I think about these things as like historical timescales and examine different scenarios. But I think it's discounted as a possibility in most geopolitical forecasts for, say, the next 10 years as being something that could have strategic relevance. Instead, has basically been my main focus of just bring it into the Overton window for a serious analysis. Because if you don't analyze something that, say, is like very small prior probability, you might assign like a 1% chance that Bitcoin can monetize to the level of gold by 2030. But if that were to happen, it would have strategic and macroeconomically relevant effects. And we analyze lots of scenarios that have a very low likelihood but high consequence. And so I would put that in the bucket of things that, like whatever your credence is, should be a little bit higher. May not be 50%, but it should be relatively high to force like serious analysis of like the what if, right, and the cascading implications for the global economic system. But to your like basic question, could Bitcoin serve a role as like a vehicle currency? Like not anytime soon, right? Like basically its volatility has to converge to equivalent to what we now use as current kind of medium of exchange. And volatility is a function of uncertainty, right? So you could hypothesize, this is loosely empirically validated, but we only have like 13 years of data, so kind of a weak sample set. But that basic hypothesis would be Bitcoin's volatility is a function of uncertainty over future adoption. So like by assumption, if you assumed Bitcoin reached saturation adoption at whatever the total market value could be, I won't pick a number, but like if you assume basically everyone that wanted to use Bitcoin was using Bitcoin, and the marginal future adopter was basically saturated, then the future assumption over future adoption would basically be nil, and the volatility associated with Bitcoin's purchasing power would roughly correspond to the rate of change of productivity on an annual basis, which might be roughly GDP, so a few percentage points. So under that hypothesis, Bitcoin's volatility could converge to the level of what we have as like current transactions. That's probably a necessary, maybe not a sufficient condition for it to become a medium of exchange. There, it's much more like the geopolitical and the political question, right? Like, will governments like allow it to go on that path, right? Like that's an exogenous question, right? That's a question of what is the stance of different jurisdictions going to be with respect to Bitcoin? Will it be hostile? Will it be neutral? Will it be accommodative? And we're sort of seeing that dynamic play out like right now, right? We're seeing different states take different postures with respect to Bitcoin. And those postures are like in the act right now being formulated, right? So President Biden came out with the digital assets executive order just a few months ago. There's like heavy interest in the Senate and the House in formulating legislation about digital assets and Bitcoin. Lots of folks in the White House and the Treasury Department are starting to take a look at this. Like cryptocurrency used to be just the remit of like FinCEN and OFAC, principally through its nexus as a vehicle for like ransomware and sort of crypto related or enabled financial crimes. And that's still kind of like I think has loaded the dice in a lot of national security and policymakers' minds, because their only encounter with Bitcoin for the past 10 years has been bad guys using it, right? And yet, like the reality has far outstripped that in terms of the actual use cases in non-criminal contexts. And that's I think where you're seeing kind of the different perceptions and attitudes kind of being shaped in real time. So yeah, it's an open political question, right? Like Bitcoin's not inevitable, I don't think, right? There are scenarios that could delay or forestall its continued monetization. But that's where it moves from just the endogenous, like what are the basic capabilities of the network as a peer-to-peer money system, that can go across borders, that doesn't rely on the issuance decisions of a centralized authority. That kind of gives you the baseline. These are the necessary conditions to have a global monetary structure. How you actually go from A to B, where B is Bitcoin is the medium exchange for the global system, there's a lot of steps in between that I think you'd have to individually assess the course of events and the probabilities thereof to make any statement about the likelihood of that end state. And I don't have I presume no special insight as to how likely that those are.
Well, if you do generate that special insight, let me know so I can position myself accordingly and get ready to buy my island. I think, and by the way, I remember distinctly when boomer congressmen and senators started going on Twitter and tweeting about Bitcoin as if they had suddenly discovered that it was this newfound interest, and remember wanting to light myself on fire that these people had suddenly discovered crypto, and we're going to talk about it in Washington at that level. But I think that's sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, like, there's now active interest in Congress trying to reach out. Like, I'm actually going to be speaking to a U.S. senator on Friday to answer some questions about this, right? There are people that they realize this is not going away. This isn't a fad. This is now here. Like, they need to learn about it and understand it and try to really dig in. It's just like any other policy topic, right? And that's happening now, right? It hasn't really been a serious thing until recently.
Yeah. Well, let's end it there. Let's just consider that a little hors d'oeuvre for the broader crypto conversation that we'll hopefully have you back on to talk about soon. So, Matt, thanks so much. Have a great day.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.